one of the things that makes it really hard to walk away from situations like that is that you do have it pretty good compared to other people. And there's this sense of guilt of like, who am I to want something different when I already have it pretty okay, given the general state of the world, right? And so I was entertaining this notion of giving up and just finding a way to deal with it. And when I actually gave myself permission to think about what that would actually look like, 10 years down the road, what would it look like if I just stayed here and continued on this path? What I saw was, and this is not to be hyperbolic, but I was really convinced that I would probably end up dead by the time I was 50 due to poor health and, a drinking problem potentially and things of that nature, because I could already see where I was doing some of these things to numb.
Hi everyone, thank you again for joining us for another episode of the Blooming Late Scientist podcast. I hope you're enjoying what you've heard so far. We've had some amazing people on here talking about their journeys, and today is absolutely no different. I'm so pleased to have Jackie Coley on the podcast. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Jackie, because I don't want to take the limelight away from you. So go ahead, tell us about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. It's such an honor to chat with you, and I'm so excited for our conversation. So just a bit about me. I am a scientist turned coach. I'm a PhD trained scientist. I have a background in biomedical sciences and cell biology. And what I do now is completely different. So I help individuals who are at a point in their career where they might be really good at what they're doing and seem really outwardly successful to those looking in, but something doesn't quite fit anymore. Either they no longer love it, maybe they did before, but they don't now, or they did like I did, which we can get into later, where they chased what they were really good at and got stuck doing a job that they were technically proficient at, but wasn't really their passion. But either way, something needs to change. And so what I do is I help them find the path that's more aligned with what they want to be doing in life, map out a strategy to get there, and then actually start walking on that new path so they can start doing work that actually lights them up.
Such a needed service. And, particularly, I don't know about you, what you think, Jackie, it'd be good to hear, but particularly coming from academia, it's so easy to get stuck in what you think you should do. And I just think having someone on your side that kind of is there to guide you is just so helpful to overcome hurdles almost along the way. And, I guess for you, do you think many of the hurdles are created by ourselves?
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. I experienced all of them and I see them in my clients now, but the biggest ones are things like, but this is all I know how to do, or this is all I'm trained to do. And coupled with that is usually something along the lines of, well, what are my family and friends going to think if I decide to make a 180 shift and do something completely different, which is what I did when I left the traditional job path and went the entrepreneurial route. I was really worried, like, what were people going to think? Because it was such a departure from what was expected. And a lot of us operate based on what we expect or what we think others expect of us. So yeah, there's a lot of hurdles and we put them all in front of ourselves. Absolutely.
I can relate to this so much. I had a different career before I was a scientist. And then I went into science and did my PhD. And despite having that other experience, I still got bogged down with that mindset that this was all I could do now. I was a specialist and I couldn't get out of it. And what would people think of me if I did a PhD and then I went and did marketing again? People would judge me. So I find that so relatable, and I think many people will. I guess the question I want to ask you is, how does the kind of coaching thing go down? Do people understand the point of coaching, and do people understand just how much it can actually help them?
I think it depends on the audience. So the people that I attract tend to have a similar background to me. They tend to be reformed academics who left academia for one reason or another and are out in industry and trying to find their way career-wise. And I know I certainly hadn't had any experience with coaching before I started down the personal development path. And a lot of the people, when they first meet me, have never worked with a coach before and don't really know what coaching is. A lot of people compare it to therapy. It's very different from therapy. And so part of what I feel is my role is to help educate people about what coaching is, the power of it, and what it can really do for them. Um, I think part of the reason for that is because, us academics, we are professional students, and a lot of us had been in school for a long time, and there are a lot of built-in support networks in that process and in that structure. And so you come to be familiar with the need for support, but you don't realize that once you're out of a system like that, it's on you to find the support on your own. And I think that's where a really powerful coach can come in, and help guide you in the same way that, say, a good academic advisor might be able to guide you in a different setting. But it's a lot of you have to take ownership for it and search for it yourself once you're out on your own, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite fascinating. And like I say, it's just obviously such a needed service. But do you work with individuals? Do you work with businesses? How does that work in terms of your coaching?
So I work just with individuals. I'm strictly it's called B2C business.
Yes.
So yeah, I primarily market on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. That's where I post content, connect with other people. We have conversations, and if that leads to us working together, great. If not, if they get some value out of the interaction, that's great too. I consider that a huge win. And yeah, my goal is to ultimately just help empower those who feel a calling to do something more, believe in themselves and see what's possible, and develop the courage to actually take those steps and start creating the kind of impact that they feel called to create in the world. Because, at the end of the day, I feel like if more of us did those things that lit us up, that it would make the world a better place in some way.
I actually really like your content. I find a lot of it so relatable and helpful, and you often give quite good tips. And sometimes you post things, and I actually think it's like you've been inside my head, um, thinking those thoughts. And I guess it's because we might have similar backgrounds. But yeah, a lot of the stuff that you say about people holding themselves back, I relate to so much. But let's dig in a little bit to your kind of journey to where you are now, because the reason I did the Blooming Late Scientist podcast was because I think we spoke about this earlier, that there are so many people that believe you have to have this kind of straight line, traditional route to where you are as a scientist, or whether you've left the lab or done whatever job you're doing now. Many people think you have to have been the top student at school, and you might have got the top grades in sciences, and then you went to college, and then you went to university, and a very traditional path. But actually, the more I speak to people, the more I realize that many of them don't have traditional paths, and it would be so helpful for us to hear about that. So can you tell us a bit about your kind of the very beginning of your formal education?
Yeah. So I also thought that was the path I was supposed to be on. That was the story that I had learned from my parents, that, you go to school, you get good grades, go to college, get a good education, you get a good job, do the work thing, and then you get to retire when you're old. That was what I thought my life was going to look like in a nutshell. That is not how it turned out, actually. It started out as one would expect. I was a good student. I was a very good student. I got good grades. I liked school. I loved going to school. It was my favorite thing. And so it made a lot of sense up until the point when I was in college, and I realized that there was a lot more to life than just getting good grades, and trying to find a good job. What ended up happening was I I went through and I got my first undergrad degree in chemistry. I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry. But what happened while I was a student is I started working in a laboratory that did biology experiments. And so I was learning how to do all these biology techniques and had no background for it. And so when I graduated, I didn't have any practical experience in the education that I had, which was a weird mismatch. So I did what any good young person would do, and I procrastinated getting a real job and spent a year as an English teacher. after I graduated from college the first time, because I just didn't know what I wanted to do, and I needed some space to figure it out. And I found a way to go live in Japan for a year as an English teacher.
Oh, wow.
And it was a wonderful experience. I learned so much about myself and the world, and all of the, all of these life skills that I hadn't acquired yet. Came back after a year, got a job and in a biology lab, and realized that I didn't like not understanding the science behind what I was doing with my hands. And so I ended up going back to school a second time and got another bachelor's degree. And preparation for doing something beyond that, either medical school or graduate school, or I wanted more education. And I was finally doing it from a slightly more intentional purpose, a more intentional way than I had done my first degree. And yeah, it was one of those things where I was course correcting as I was going, and I thought that there was something wrong with me for doing that. But at the end of the day, that was the journey I needed to be on. Those were the lessons I needed to learn so that I could navigate my path in a way that made sense for me. And eventually I ended up in grad school as a result of all of that.
How do you think that kind of break, so to speak, where you were in Japan, do you think that helped you in the next part of your journey? Because I think, I'm sure you will agree that many people in that particular moment might see that as some sort of failure. They might think, oh, I've ended up doing this, but how did that help you in the next part of your journey?
It gave me perspective. And I didn't appreciate it at the time because, like I said, I went because I literally didn't want to get a job. Like, I did not want to get a job after I graduated. And I want to point that out, because when you're 21 and you make a decision like that, it's okay, right? Like, I'm here many decades later and I'm fine. I'm doing great. Like, none of these decisions that we make along the way, we think that they're big deals, that they're going to put you on a path with guardrails that you can never deviate from. And that is not true. It doesn't have to be true, right? So I just wanted to, I know it's a side note, I just want to point that out, though, just to give people permission to do what makes sense for them, even if it doesn't necessarily look like it would fit into someone else's idea of what your life should look like. But what that detour to Japan did for me was it gave me some time to think and to have some perspective about what it is that I wanted to do, and it also let me grow up a little bit. It was the first time I had ever lived that far away from my family. I was on the other side of the planet and was having to be an adult in a way that I didn't have to be when I was in college. And I think that was a really important time because I forged new friendships with people from all over the world, and got to experience another culture in a way that you don't get to experience when you're just traveling as, for holiday. And yeah, by the time I came back, I feel like I was in a much better place to make a more intentional decision about what I was going to do next in my life versus just doing the thing because it was expected of me, which was kind of how I'd made all my decisions up until that point.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be my next question. So, like, where do you think you'd have been had you not taken that break? But I guess you've just answered that in that you would have stayed doing what you were doing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it probably would have been some sort of a like lab tech kind of a position, where you do the assays and you hand the data off to someone who actually makes the decisions and interprets it and writes the papers, gets credit for it. And, there's only not that there's anything wrong with that, but it wouldn't have been as satisfying a journey, I think, for me as the one I ended up traveling on. So, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, what I find quite interesting is you went back to university slightly later to do your PhD, right?
Yes.
So how did you end up at this point?
Well, so I went to graduate school at the time thinking that I was going to be a professor. And I don't think that's necessarily uncommon, or at least it wasn't at the time. I think now things have changed quite a bit in academia, and the opportunities for like a professorship are not quite as available as they were several years ago. However, that was what I wanted. I wanted to do amazing research, and I wanted to have a lab and teach students and, do all of the professor things. And I quickly realized that I am not temperamentally suited for the level of uncertainty and failure that goes along with doing research and experiments. It just made me feel dumb. Like, frankly, I always felt inadequate and like I was struggling in graduate school, not because I wasn't good at the science. I want to be really clear that this was a mindset issue. This was a story I was telling myself. I was very good in the lab. I was really good at doing the experiments and interpreting the data. I had a harder time dealing with the fact that when you're experimenting, things go wrong, and that's part of the process. And I was in a lab with several people who were really excited about that kind of stuff. I felt really beat down because of that. And so I realized that pretty quickly that there was no way that I was going to do well as a research scientist going forward after graduate school. So I knew by the time I graduated, by the time I defended my thesis, that I was going to be out of academia for my next step. And so I never even entertained the idea of doing a postdoc or doing anything along those lines. I landed a job as a forensic toxicologist for the crime lab here in North Carolina as my first job outside of graduate school. And at the time, it ticked all the right boxes. It was exactly what I wanted. It was a nice combination of doing laboratory work as well as data analysis and also some educating of the public, because as a forensic scientist, we would have to go and testify in court about our results from time to time. And so there were a whole bunch of things that I really enjoyed about that job because it made a lot of sense and it aligned with my personality and my temperament and things of that nature. So yeah, so I found this job and it was great right up until it wasn't anymore. And after several years of doing this, I reached a point where I was technically proficient at it and was pretty good at it, but it wasn't fulfilling and it wasn't as joyful as I was thinking it was going to be. And I had to get out of there because it was rapidly becoming a toxic work environment. There was just a lot of misalignments. It just wasn't for me. And the longer I stayed, the more discomfort and frustration I was feeling. So it was through the process of getting out of that environment where I felt stuck. I had been there long enough that I was very much in that mindset of, this is all I know how to do. I'm never going to be able to find another job. Oh my God, and it was through that process of working through all of that and getting out of that stuckness that I discovered personal development. And it's what ultimately got me on the path to where I am now, where I'm helping others who are stuck in that similar kind of a situation find their path.
Yeah. I guess, it just makes you so relatable because you've traveled the path that they're on, right? But how did you finally find the courage to do that? Because it's so hard, isn't it, to get unstuck sometimes? How did you do that?
For me, it was a moment where I had this moment where I was thinking about, well, what if I just found a way to cope with it? Right? Like, one of the things that's really hard when it comes to walking away from a role where it looks like you're doing well, at least to somebody external, it looks like you're doing well when they're looking at your life from the outside. You make good money, it's a stable job, there's benefits and retirement, all that stuff. It looks good, but you're miserable inside. And one of the things that makes it really hard to walk away from situations like that is that you do have it pretty good compared to other people. And there's this sense of guilt of like, who am I to want something different when I already have it pretty okay, given the general state of the world, right? And so I was entertaining this notion of giving up and just finding a way to deal with it. And when I actually gave myself permission to think about what that would actually look like, 10 years down the road, what would it look like if I just stayed here and continued on this path? What I saw was, and this is not to be hyperbolic, but I was really convinced that I would probably end up dead by the time I was 50 due to poor health and, a drinking problem potentially and things of that nature, because I could already see where I was doing some of these things to numb and cope with the discomfort of what I was experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Not just like what I was experiencing at work, but hiding it from everybody else, I was going out after work and having a glass or two of wine with some friends and then complaining about work and bitching about everything. And, I could totally see how that could compound and spiral over time, not to mention the fact that I was neglecting my health. I wasn't working out. I was withdrawing from some of my relationships and my friendships, aside from the people I was complaining with and commiserating with, because misery loves company. And I could just see
Mm.
that if I were to continue that behavior, that it would just continue to erode both my physical and mental well-being. And it scared the hell out of me. And that was my wake-up call. I don't remember exactly what triggered me to or what prompted me to think about it that way. I think it was a training or something I saw on, Facebook, that, just some little video or somebody talking about this and just planting that seed of like, well, what would happen if I continue this way? And it was enough. It was a wake-up call, that I had to make a decision in that moment. And that was my line in the sand. And I was like, no more. I can't do this. I'm not going to do this. I didn't spend all of this time on my education and my skills and, all of this energy and effort to just give up on my life now going forward. So that was my moment.
Absolutely kudos to you for being able to recognize at the time that there was a problem, because I think about things in my life that have been like this, and often I've not seen it until I've looked back, and not perhaps recognized it at the time. And the quote about misery loves company, I found in my PhD, after one of my very close friends left, that I was, we were drawn to each other, people that were complaining about the academic environment and the struggles. And whilst it's good to have somebody to lean on, it does spiral, doesn't it? You kind of create this environment for yourself, and how you manage to recognize that in the moment is quite incredible. And yeah, absolute kudos to you for doing that, because it is
Thank
so
you.
hard. Going back to your PhD, so one of the questions I know that's going to come up is, how did you find doing a PhD after having a break from kind of the academic life? What were the challenges you faced?
The way that I got into the PhD program required me getting a second bachelor's degree because I wasn't the best student the first time around, just to be completely frank. Also, it was in a field that wasn't really what I was knowledgeable about, right? Like, because I had all of this experience in biology labs and I didn't understand any of the theory behind it. And so I made a choice to go back to school and get another bachelor's degree in biology in particular, and to spend some of that time forging connections and building relationships with my professors so that I would have people to write recommendation letters and to advise me on what to do next as far as which schools to apply to and what programs would make sense for me. And so it was a sort of a traditional way to get into grad school, because I think that's how a lot of people do it. It's just that I did it many years after a lot of my my classmates in graduate school had done it, age-wise. So the process was pretty similar. The difference was that I had done it for a deliberate reason, and that's because, like I said, I wanted to be a professor, and that was the mechanism to do that, as far as I understood it. And so it wasn't a huge shift, simply because I had had a couple of years in school again before I made that shift into graduate school. So it didn't feel quite as jarring. But what was interesting was that I was about 10 years older than most of my classmates. And I realized, I'm like, oh, I have a very different worldview than the vast majority of you. It's not that we couldn't be friends and we couldn't form connections, but it was interesting because those who had gone straight through college and straight into grad school had a very different set of experiences than I did. And so I thought that was really interesting. And I liked that. Of course, I'm going to like it, right? I'm not going to say that my life was terrible and I hate how it turned out. But no, in hindsight, I realized that what that extra time living my life before I went to grad school did was it allowed me to have a little bit more perspective about some of the things that I think we struggle with in grad school. And one of the big ones has to do, at least with me, was my communication with my mentor. We had a rocky start to our relationship, and we had very different communication styles. And I think that because I was older, I was more comfortable with having tough conversations and setting boundaries and saying no to her. Whereas if I had been 10 years younger me wouldn't have been courageous enough to push back, and would have just acquiesced and given away all my power and just, blindly accepted that, oh, well, you're the authority here and I need to do what you say. And so I think that made a big difference. But as far as the actual transition from being out in the workforce and into school, it was a pretty smooth one, I think, just because I had that buffer of a second degree in the middle there.
It's so interesting that you bring up this concept of pushing back and that being easier when you're slightly older. I had a very similar experience where I found it quite easy just to say, no, I don't understand why I need to do that. That doesn't make sense. That isn't going to be a productive route for me to take. And for very similar reasons, I had a lot of friction with my supervisor when I did a PhD, because that person had only ever supervised those that had come straight out of like college, university, and like, same, were like 12, 15 years younger than me. And I always find this so interesting that, in many jobs, the ability to push back is such a positive, but in that initial kind of relationship in a PhD, there's kind of like a bit of time to get used to each other and get used to the fact that you work in completely different ways, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I think that there's a skill component to this. Having conversations is a skill. And a lot of us who are introverted don't recognize that at first. And I think that that's one of the things that I notice a lot in the people that I interact with and that I help, is a lot of them also tend to be introverted, and they make assumptions. And I used to do this too. So there's no judgment on this. It totally like we all do it, right? But
Yeah.
when you're introverted, there's often this assumption that because I am introverted, therefore I'm not good at communication. I'm not a people person. And the truth is that the two have nothing to do with each other. Communication and relationship building or networking, which is the big scary word that freaks a lot of people out.
Yes.
Those are all skills. They're just skills that you can learn if you choose to learn them. And they have nothing to do with whether or not you're an introvert. But I didn't, when I was younger, I didn't really appreciate that. And I think that being slightly older and having a bit more of a different perspective on things and a willingness to step up and have the difficult conversations and trust that just because you disagree with somebody, just because you guys don't see eye to eye, doesn't mean that you can't come to some sort of mutual understanding. And, being willing to do that and step into that discomfort, I think that was really, what was going to make the difference. And yeah, it was, it took us a while. It's not like it was a one and done thing. It took a while. And then even after we came to an agreement, because she and I had very different, we still do, she's still alive. We have very different communication styles. And that never changed. It was that we each had to recognize that and communicate with each other in a way that accommodated both of our communication styles so that we were on the same page. And that took an effort every single day, every single time. So it wasn't like we just solved it. But if I had never had the courage to say, I don't understand what's going on here. Can you please explain this to me? Or I feel like we're not on the same page about this. Can we go through it again or review this? If I wasn't willing to do that and to push back whenever she's like, whenever she would say, oh, well, we never talked about that, or we did talk about this and I don't remember this conversation happening. The more I was willing to stand up and say, I want us to understand, the easier it was over the long term for us to have a good relationship. But
what a great way for both of you to learn how to communicate, in the long term, because we all think that we have our communication style, but the reality is that we all need to be quite fluid in the way we communicate, depending on who's receiving that message.
Yes.
So that must have been such a valuable lesson for both of you.
Absolutely. It was uncomfortable. I mean, it's easy to talk about it now, but at the time, yeah, I would go into those meetings, heart pounding, sweating a little bit, really nervous, but it was necessary. And that's when it comes down to anything that's scary, that's really the question we have to ask ourselves is, am I willing to step into this discomfort for the sake of this greater good, and it can be, it's not that I've met plenty of younger people who are very, very courageous. You know, I see people who are going after what they want, you know, in their 20s, and they're making things happen. And I'm like, wow, I wish I had been like that when I was their age. But, you know, for me, it took a longer time to get to a point where I was comfortable doing that. And so it takes all kinds. We all have different journeys. We all have different uh, speeds at which we learn these lessons, I suppose.
Yeah. And I imagine, I mean, now you're obviously coaching, having someone like you on side kind of helps accelerate that in some ways, or just makes the process perhaps more comfortable. But
Mhm.
thinking about you, what kind of support and mentorship did you have along the way?
To become a coach or
Yes.
in graduate school for the
Or in
coaching.
graduate school, like all along, did you have any kind of standout mentors? Or you don't have to name them, but I'm just thinking about the whole idea of support and mentorship.
I think well, in graduate school, the mentorship was pretty standard. I think it was the professors on my advisory committee and other people that I knew in the department, and then the peer network. You know, we had I had a pretty good friend group. We supported each other during the tough times and the good times. Um, once I was pursuing my coaching business and really considering doing this, you know, as my path, and accepting that, I knew that I needed help. And I would recommend that anyone who decides to make any kind of a shift, that be the first question that they ask themselves: who do I need to learn this from? Who can teach me and help me and guide me? Because trying to figure out something that you have never done before on your own is not the best way to move forward. It takes a long time, if you're even successful in the first place, because you're doing something that you just don't have the experience and you don't have the skills for yet.
Yeah.
I started I started by taking or by going to like free workshops. You know, I think a lot of people start this way. They see someone offering a free training on something, it kind of resonates with them in some way, shape, or form. You're like, cool, let me go spend an hour on Zoom with you and listen to what you have to say. I did a lot of that at first because I was just kind of feeling around and seeing what made sense. And then I went from there to doing online courses. I took some just self-paced, self-study courses, just to get a feel for the kinds of things that I could learn in an environment that was very different from any other learning environment I had been in thus far. Because, you know, multiple decades of traditional schooling is very different from taking an online course on something that's very specific about this one skill that you want to get a bit better at. My first experience with a coach happened when I made the decision. I really did want to be a coach. I really wanted to create my own business. I wanted to do my own thing. And I needed some help getting started with that. So my first ever experience paying for a coaching program was an online marketing program. It taught how to do organic marketing primarily on Facebook, which I just kind of used the lessons to do things on LinkedIn because Facebook's not my platform of choice. But it was it was both the most scary and the most liberating experience, because this was the first time that I made an uncomfortable level of investment in something. I paid a lot of money to join this program, and it was more money than I had ever spent on something like that before in my life. And you know, I was really scared. And I did it anyway because I needed to invest in myself. I needed to get the help. And it was a way for me to show to me that I was serious about doing this thing, that I wasn't just dabbling, and that I actually was dedicated to making a go of this and was willing to put some skin in the game in order to get the support and the training that I needed to start this process and start figuring out and learning how to put myself out there on the internet and how to show up and share my message and my content and things like that, which I'd never done before. And so this was a group program. I think there were about 20 or 30 people in the group, in the cohort, and it was great. I'd never experienced live coaching before. It was such a transformational experience, and ever since then I haven't stopped investing in myself along the way. And you know, it looks different. It can be a group program, it could be some sort of an intensive, it can be a one-on-one thing, and it depends on what it's going to depend on what each person needs at any given stage of their process and their journey. But once I had a taste of what it was like to actually get some direct support from an expert who had done what I was trying to do, she had already walked this path and had figured it out, and she was streamlining the process, in her area of expertise, which is what I do for my clients in my area of expertise now. Once I learned the power and experienced the power of getting some support from another human being, who was good at what I wanted to do, that changed everything. And yeah, and I had never experienced it before. It was again, you reach a point where you either have to make a decision to move forward and do the scary thing, or you stay on the side of the line where you feel more comfortable and stay the same. And I needed to do this in order to prove to myself that I was serious about it. And that's why I made that scary first investment. And I have no regrets whatsoever. And I would do it over again in a heartbeat, and haven't stopped investing in myself ever since.
I think do you know what? I just love that story because it's so key, isn't it? We often wait for other people to invest in us rather than thinking, I need to take control of this situation and invest in myself. And I love what you say. It's kind of like, there's a quote, I believe, that's something like, feel the fear and do it anyway, or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's so true, isn't it? Sometimes you have to take the next step, even though it scares the life out of you. You just have to keep moving forward.
Absolutely.
So I guess kind of one of the final questions I have for you is, what would you say to someone who is, stuck like you were at the beginning, or like you were when you did forensic toxicology? What do you say to someone who's stuck, who says, well, I can't do this. I can only do what I know, and I need to stay doing what I'm doing. It's too late for me.
The first thing I would say is that it's really important to give yourself the space to explore what it would look like to be unstuck. So rather than dive into all kinds of advice about or about mindset, no, you can overcome your limiting beliefs. These are just stories. You can question your assumptions. These are all really important things to learn. But what I've realized that a lot of people need, and that I needed, and it took me a little while to have this realization, that the thing that I needed to change before I was ever ready to consider getting unstuck was to give myself the permission to want something different than what I had, just to entertain the idea of it. And so one question I like to ask is, if you could have it anyway, if you could wave a magic wand and create the life that you want, like, what would that look like? Not worrying about the how, not worrying about whether or not it's feasible or whether or not it's something your family's going to understand, without worrying about any of those things that inevitably will crop up when we try to entertain this idea. Just give yourself the space to dream with the abandon of a child, about what you would do, what you would want to have, and what you would want to be if anything were possible. If you had all the money in the world and you knew you couldn't fail, what would you want?
That's just a fantastic note to end on. I guess what people are really going to want to know is, where can they find you, and where can they find out more about you in the coaching business?
Yeah, so there's two main places where people can connect with me. I do have a website. It's jackiecoley.com. I'm also really active on LinkedIn, so just search for Jackie Coley. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn almost every single day. That's where I like to post content. And yeah, if this is something, that if someone's out there and you feel like you're stuck and you want a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of motivation, maybe a little bit of tough love to get that ball rolling, get out of that rut. Yeah, come check me out. Send a connection request. I'd love to hear from you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jackie. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and, just have a chat about things that feel so relatable. And I'm sure many people will feel the same way. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So to everyone else, I hope you've enjoyed the show. Do let us know if you have any questions. Get in touch with Jackie. Like she says, if you feel stuck and you'd like some help. And we'll see you next time on the Blooming Late Scientist podcast. Thank you.